Gentlemen, the window is closing. We have a break in the front here, but the ceiling remains low, and the coastal batteries will be obscured.
They're counting on us. Do your duty, trooper. We fight tonight. Move up! Get off the beach! Keep moving!
Move those trucks up the embankment now. Get this gear off the beach, quickly.
On the evening of June 4th, 1944, a 53-year-old general from Abilene, Kansas, sat alone in a trailer at Southwick House in southern England and wrote a note on a small piece of paper. The note was not long. It was not eloquent. It was, in fact, written with the spare directness of a man who had been trained his whole life to say what needed to be said without wasting words. The note read, in its entirety, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the Navy did everything that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt is mine alone." He put the note in his breast pocket. He expected he might need it. The note was never used. The landings did not fail. The beachhead held. The troops did not need to be withdrawn. But the fact that Dwight David Eisenhower wrote that note, the fact that he sat down before giving the order that sent 156,000 men across the English Channel toward a defended coast, and wrote the statement that would explain the disaster if there was a disaster, tells you something essential about the man and about the decision he was making. He knew it might fail. He knew the cost of failure would be measured in the lives of the men he was sending. And he made a decision anyway, alone, against the advice of his meteorologists who told him the weather was wrong, against the private doubts of some of his most trusted commanders, against every calculation of risk that said the conditions were not right. This is the story of that decision, not just what Eisenhower decided, but why it was his alone to make, how he came to it, and what it reveals about the specific kind of leadership that the most complex military operation in history required. Because the decision to launch Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944, was not the product of committee. It was not the product of consensus. It was the product of one man in a trailer, in the rain, who understood that the window was closing and that the cost of waiting might be higher than the cost of going. The planning for the invasion of France had been underway since 1942. The specific location, Normandy rather than the Pas-de-Calais, which was a shorter crossing and a more obvious choice, had been argued over for months. The specific date, a window of acceptable tides and acceptable light that occurred only a few days each month, had been calculated by experts whose calculations were necessarily imprecise because they were predicting the weather in the English Channel in early June, which is one of the less predictable things in the world. The force, the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare, had been assembled over years at enormous cost in treasure and logistics and the sustained effort of the entire Allied industrial machine. All of this was in place by the spring of 1944. What remained was a decision that only one man could make. Eisenhower had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December 1943 by President Roosevelt, a choice that surprised some observers who had expected command to go to George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, who was arguably the more distinguished military mind and certainly the more senior officer. Roosevelt kept Marshall in Washington because he felt he could not run the war without him, and Eisenhower got the command that would define his career and his place in history. He arrived in England in January 1944 to take up the job. The job was unlike any military command that had previously existed. Eisenhower was not simply commanding an army. He was commanding armies, American, British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and forces from a dozen other allied nations, in an operation that required not just military coordination, but political management of extraordinary complexity. The personalities under his command included some of the most difficult men in the Allied military establishment. Montgomery, who was brilliant and insufferable; Patton, who was indispensable and ungovernable; Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, who was pessimistic about the airborne component of the operation to the point of obstruction. Managing these men, keeping them focused, keeping them productive, keeping them from destroying each other in the operation with their conflicts, was itself a full-time job before the military planning even began. I want to take a moment here and ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. This series is about the specific decisions of specific people, the moments when history turned on one man's judgment. If that's the kind of history you want, subscribe now and hit the bell. Back to Eisenhower, back to the spring of 1944, and the problem that was keeping him awake at night. The specific military situation that made the Normandy decision so consequential requires some unpacking, because a popular understanding of D-Day tends to compress the complexity of what was actually being attempted into a story of courage and heroism that, while true, obscures the specifically intellectual dimensions of what Eisenhower was managing. The German defenses in France in the spring of 1944 were formidable, but they were not uniformly strong. The Wehrmacht had more than 50 divisions in France, the Low Countries, and along the Atlantic Wall. The fortification system that Rommel had been building up since his appointment to command Army Group B in late 1943. But these divisions were spread across hundreds of miles of coastline, and the German High Command was divided about where the Allied invasion would actually come. Hitler and the OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, believed that the Pas-de-Calais was a primary invasion site, and that any landing elsewhere was a feint. Rommel was less certain, but was constrained by the command structure that divided authority over the reserve panzer divisions between himself, the OKW, and Hitler personally. This division of German opinion was not accidental. It was a product of the fortitude deception operation that had been built over months by the Double Cross Network, particularly Juan Pujo Garcia's Garbo Network, which had convinced German intelligence that a massive army group under General Patton was preparing to strike at Calais. The deception was still operating on June 6th, and it would continue to operate for weeks after the landings, as Garbo's fictional network reported that Normandy was a diversion and that the real attack was still coming at Calais. Eisenhower knew about fortitude. He understood that the deception was one of the critical elements of the operation, that the specific advantage the Allies had in intelligence, built through the code-breaking and the double agents that had been developed over years, was a force multiplier that could partially compensate for the numerical and tactical advantages of the defenders. But he also knew that deceptions are fragile, that a single mistake, a single compromised agent, a single piece of information reaching the wrong person at the wrong time could unravel months of careful work and leave the landings to face a German response that the deception had been designed to prevent. The weight of all this, the deception, the intelligence, the weather, the tides, the politics, the personalities of his commanders, the specific tactical situations on each beach, was what Eisenhower was carrying when he sat in the library at Southwick House on the evening of June 4th. He was not simply deciding whether the weather was good enough to go. He was making a judgment about the total strategic situation, about the balance of risks and opportunities, the margins of error available in each dimension of the operation, the specific ways in which each element of the plan was vulnerable, and the specific ways in which each element provided insurance against the vulnerabilities of the others. This kind of synthetic judgment, the ability to hold simultaneously in mind the meteorological, the tactical, the strategic, the political, and the human dimensions of decision, and to integrate them into a single recommendation about what to do, is not something that any of Eisenhower's subordinates possessed in combination. Montgomery was a superb operational commander, but a difficult political ally. Ramsey was a first-rate naval administrator, but was focused on the naval dimension. Lee Mallory was technically competent, but systematically pessimistic. None of them could hold the full picture the way Eisenhower held it, and none of them had the authority that the full picture required. The specific way that Eisenhower's authority had been structured, the decision made during the planning of Overlord, that the Supreme Commander would have genuine authority over all three services and over the Allied forces of multiple nations, was itself a significant achievement that should not be taken for granted. Allied command in previous operations have been characterized by inter-service friction, national rivalries, and a kind of diffuse authority that produces compromised planning rather than decisive action. the Torch landings in North Africa, the Sicily landings, the Italian campaign. All of these have been complicated by command structures that made clear decision-making difficult. Overlord was different, partly because of the specific command arrangement that gave Eisenhower genuine authority, and partly because of the specific personality Eisenhower brought to the role. He was not a dominating personality in the way that Patton or Montgomery were dominating. He did not impose himself on his subordinates through force of will or personal magnetism. He managed through patience, through the construction of consensus where consensus was possible, and through the willingness to make clear decisions when consensus was not possible. His subordinates sometimes found him too accommodating, too willing to hear all sides, too slow to decide. What they were observing was not weakness. It was a deliberate process of a man who knew that in a coalition operation, the cost of overriding his subordinates unnecessarily was higher than the cost of taking the time to bring them along. But when the time came to decide, he decided. June 4th was the proof of this. The commanders in the room had given him their assessments. The meteorologist had given him the forecast. The deception staff had given him the status of fortitude. The intelligence teams had given him the latest assessment of German dispositions. He had heard it all, and when he had heard it all, he said what needed to be said without qualification or condition or reference to further information that might be sought. Okay, we'll go. The specific question of what alternative Eisenhower had on June 4th, what he would have done if he had decided not to go, is worth examining because it illuminates what the decision actually cost and what the options actually were. The most immediate alternative was a further postponement, waiting for the next available window of acceptable weather and tides, which Stagg's team estimated would open around June 19th. This was not a small delay. It was 2 additional weeks of waiting with the force assembled and ready, the deception operation continuing to hold, but under increasing pressure from the accumulated tension of preparation and the strategic situation in the Soviet Union evolving in ways that the Western Allies could not control. The Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, was planned for late June in coordination with Overlord. Its timing was predicated on the German forces in the West being engaged by the Allied landings, drawing German reserves away from the Eastern Front. A 2-week delay in Overlord would not have been a catastrophic problem for Bagration. The Soviet planning had flexibility built in, but would have changed the relationship between the two operations in ways that the Allied planning had tried to avoid. Stalin had been demanding the Second Front for 2 years. Another 2 weeks of delay, after the force was assembled and the date had been set and then reset, would have been a diplomatic problem as well as a military one. There was also the question of security. Every additional day that the force sat in its embarkation areas was a day during which German intelligence had the opportunity to assemble evidence about the operation's true objective. The fortitude deception had been maintained with extraordinary discipline, but deceptions are not infinitely resilient. The more people who know the target is Normandy, and by June 1944, a very large number of people knew, the greater the risk that the knowledge reaches German intelligence in a form that is actionable. 2 additional weeks of waiting was 2 additional weeks of exposure, and there was the weather itself. The June 5th and 6th window was the first acceptable window of the month. The next window was around the 19th, but a June 19th landing would have coincided, by the chance of meteorology, with one of the most severe storms to hit the English Channel in decades, the storm that destroyed the Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach and set back the Allied buildup by weeks. If Eisenhower had waited for the 19th window, the invasion fleet would have been attempting to land troops on Normandy beaches in conditions that were far worse than anything that the actual June 6th landing encountered. Whether the landings could have been conducted at all under those conditions is genuinely uncertain. Eisenhower did not know any of this on June 4th, of course. He could not know that the storm was coming. He made his decision on the basis of the information available, and the information available pointed toward going. The subsequent events, the actual success of the June 6th landing and the catastrophic storm of June 19th, validated his decision in a way that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. The decision was right for reasons that were partly beyond the available information, and this is characteristic of decisions at the level of strategic command. They are made under uncertainty, and the uncertainty means that even good decisions can be validated or refuted by events that were not predictable at the time. The study of Eisenhower's decision-making at Southwick House has produced a significant secondary literature in the fields of decision theory and leadership studies that has extended far beyond the military context. Business schools use the June 4th decision as a case study in exactly the kind of decision that Eisenhower faced. High stakes, genuine uncertainty, time pressure, competing expert opinions, and no option that was free of significant risk. The specific way that Eisenhower processed the available information, consulted his subordinates, and then made a clear decision rather than deferring to committee consensus or waiting for more information that was not available, is held up as a model for how leaders should behave when perfect information is unavailable and delay is itself a choice with costs. The lesson that the case study is usually taken to teach is not complicated, but it is difficult to apply. Gather the best available information, consult the relevant experts, take counsel from the people whose judgment you trust, and then decide. Don't wait for certainty that will not come. Don't defer the decision to a process that will not produce a better answer. Decide, accept the uncertainty, and take responsibility for the outcome. Eisenhower did this. The trailer, the note in the pocket, the 2 words, they are the evidence that he did it. Not just the result, which was success, but the process, which was the right process for the situation regardless of the result. A commander who had made the same decision in the same way and faced a failed landing would not have been a worse commander. He would have been a commander whose right process produced a bad outcome, which happens, and which is different from a bad process producing a bad outcome. The note was the acknowledgement of this. By writing it, Eisenhower was saying, I know the difference between a good decision and a guaranteed result. I am making the best decision available with the information I have. If it fails, the failure is mine. The troops did everything that bravery and devotion to duty could do. That sentence, the troops did everything that bravery and devotion to duty could do, is the most important sentence in the note, and it is the sentence that reveals most clearly what Eisenhower understood about his relationship to the men he commanded. He was not writing to protect himself. He was writing to protect them. If the landing failed, the men who had died on the beaches would not die having failed. They would die having succeeded at everything that was within their control. The failure, if there was a failure, would be in the decision, in his decision, not in the execution. This is the moral core of the note. The specific refusal to allow the failure of a decision to translate into the failure of the men who had to execute it. Eisenhower was accepting that the outcome of the decision was his responsibility in a way that the courage and the competence of the soldiers was not his responsibility. Those qualities belonged to the soldiers themselves, and he would not diminish them by allowing the failure of his judgment to reflect on theirs. The note was never used. The landing succeeded, but the quality of character that the note revealed, the willingness to accept full responsibility while protecting the honor of the people who carried out the decision, is the quality that makes the note worth preserving and worth discussing 80 years after it was written in a trailer in the rain in southern England. Eisenhower died in 1969. He is buried at Abilene, in the chapel of the presidential library that bears his name. The note is in a glass case nearby. The 2 words are not preserved anywhere except in the accounts of the people who were in the room, in the memoirs and the oral histories and the recollections of men who were present at one of the most consequential moments in modern military history and who understood what they were witnessing. Okay, we'll go. A general from Kansas, a trailer in the rain, the note in the pocket that was never needed, and 156,000 men crossing the English Channel toward the coast of France, carry with them the weight of everything the decision had meant and the freedom to do the specific human thing that the decision had made possible, to be brave in the specific circumstances of the specific beaches they were crossing for the specific reasons that brought them there. That is the Eisenhower decision. That is what leadership looks like when it costs something, and it is worth knowing and worth remembering, because the qualities required are the same qualities that every generation has to find for itself, in the specific rooms and the specific moments and specific impossible choices that its own history will present. The relationship between Eisenhower and his subordinate commanders, particularly his relationship with Bernard Montgomery, who commanded the Allied ground forces for the initial phase of Overlord, was one of the most consequential interpersonal dynamics of the entire European campaign, and its character was set in the weeks before the D-Day decision. Montgomery was, by common consent, one of the finest operational commanders in the British Army, possibly in any army. His victory at El Alamein in October 1942 had turned the tide in North Africa and had made him a national hero in Britain. His subsequent campaigns in Sicily and Italy had demonstrated a consistent capacity for set-piece battle, for the careful, methodical preparation of an operation and its deliberate execution according to a plan that the British Army valued highly and that had delivered results. He was also, by equally common consent, one of the most difficult men in the Allied High Command. He was arrogant in a way that went beyond the normal self-assurance of senior military officers. He genuinely believed he was a superior strategist and that operations he was not directing were being done wrong. He was frequently disrespectful to American officers, including Eisenhower, in ways that created friction that had to be carefully managed. And he had a specific approach to the command relationship, a belief that his judgment should essentially determine the plan, and that the Supreme Commander's role was to support its implementation. That was in fundamental tension with Eisenhower's understanding of his own authority. Eisenhower managed Montgomery with a patience that some of his American colleagues found excessive. Patton, in particular, was openly contemptuous of what he considered Eisenhower's deference to Montgomery and British sensitivity. Patton believed, not without justification, that the British were using their political influence to obtain a disproportionate share of the resources and the credit for the campaign. Eisenhower absorbed Patton's contempt, as he absorbed a great deal of friction from a great many people, because he understood that the coalition required managing, and that managing it meant accepting a degree of friction that any individual member of the coalition would have found intolerable. The specific consequence of this management approach for D-Day was that the Overlord Plan reflected a genuine synthesis of British and American military thinking, not a perfect synthesis, and not without its tensions, but a plan that had been shaped by the perspectives of multiple national military traditions in a way that no single tradition could have produced. The decision about where to land, how to prepare the landing, how to exploit the initial beachhead, all of these reflected an iterative process of negotiation and compromise that, by the time the force was assembled and the date was set, had produced a plan that its designers collectively owned. The day itself, June 6, 1944, played out across 5 beaches and in the air above Normandy in ways that combined the expected and the unexpected in the ratio that all military plans encounter when they meet reality. On 4 of the beaches, the landings achieved their essential objectives, though not without cost and not without specific failures of timing and coordination that the men who experienced them would remember for the rest of their lives. Omaha was different. The men of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division, the big red one, the blue and gray, came off their landing craft onto a beach that their planners had expected to be suppressed by naval bombardment and softened by prior air attack. The naval bombardment had shifted offshore to avoid hitting the landing craft, and the bombers that were supposed to crater the beach and destroy the German defenses had released late in poor visibility and deposited their bombs miles inland. The German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit whose presence at Omaha had not been fully confirmed by Allied intelligence, were in position in fortified emplacements and in full working order when the first wave of American soldiers waded ashore. The first waves at Omaha suffered catastrophic casualties. Companies that had come off the landing craft with full strength were reduced to small fractions of their original numbers within minutes. Men drowned in the surf. Men were cut down on the beach before they could take cover. The obstacles that the naval combat demolition teams were supposed to clear, the steel and concrete impediments that Rommel had placed on the beach approaches to tear apart landing craft and channel the attacking infantry into kill zones, were largely intact. For a period of perhaps 90 minutes, the outcome at Omaha was genuinely uncertain. Senior officers on the ships offshore were receiving reports from the beach that suggested the landing had failed, that the troops were pinned down and taking unsustainable casualties, that the follow-on waves could not be landed until the situation was resolved. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces, received these reports on his command ship and contemplated diverting the follow-on forces to Utah Beach, where the landing was going far better. What resolved the situation at Omaha was not additional resources or a change in plan. It was specific men making specific decisions at the unit level. Colonel George Taylor, commanding the 1st Infantry Division on the beach, walked among the pin men and said words that have been quoted in every account of Omaha Beach since. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who would die. Now, let's get the hell out of here. Sergeant William Stuyvesant, Lieutenant John Spaulding, Captain Joseph Dawson. These were the men who found the draws and the gullies and the specific weak points in the German defenses and led small groups of soldiers through them and onto the bluffs above the beach, where the German positions could be attacked from the flank and the rear. By mid-morning, the situation at Omaha was stabilized. By afternoon, the beach was being used for the landing of follow-on forces. By evening, the American position at Omaha was not secure in the sense of being beyond counterattack, but it was sufficient to continue, sufficient to build on, sufficient to justify the decision that had been made 48 hours earlier in a library in southern England. Eisenhower learned the results on June 6th as they came in through the day. He knew before noon that the operation was succeeding on most beaches. He knew later in the day that Omaha had been critical. He knew by evening that the beachhead had been established and would hold. The note in his pocket stayed in his pocket. The aftermath of D-Day was not the end of Eisenhower's difficult decisions. It was in many ways the beginning of a more sustained series of them. The breakout from Normandy, which took far longer than planned and consumed the summer of 1944 in the hedgerow fighting of the Bocage, required ongoing judgment calls about resources and priorities. The decision to let Montgomery attempt the ill-fated Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the airborne assault on the bridges of Holland that ended in the disaster at Arnhem, was another exercise of the same synthesis that D-Day had required, and it produced a different result. The winter crisis of December 1944, when the German Ardennes offensive broke through the American lines and created the situation that required the famous defense of Bastogne that we will talk about in a later episode of this series, required Eisenhower's most decisive response since June 6. His decision to commit Patton's Third Army to relieve Bastogne, made within 24 hours of the German breakthrough, was executed with the kind of speed and clarity that the situation demanded and that Eisenhower's management style had not always previously suggested he was capable of. The specific arc of Eisenhower's decisions in the European campaign, from the patient, methodical preparation of Overlord to the rapid commitment of resources at the Bulge, reflects a commander who was learning and adapting throughout the campaign, who was willing to revise his approach when the situation required it, and who never lost sight of the ultimate objective that the June 4th decision had been made in service of the defeat of Germany and the end of the war in Europe. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, 11 months after the landings at Normandy. The campaign that had begun with 2 words in a library ended with a document signed in a schoolhouse in Reims. Eisenhower was present. He did not say much. He sent a message to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington that was characteristically brief. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7, 1945. Mission fulfilled. The note in the pocket had never been needed. The decision had been right. Eisenhower returned to the United States a hero, the most celebrated American military commander since Grant or Pershing, the man who had organized and commanded the operation that liberated Western Europe. He would become the supreme Allied commander again during the Korean War period, then president, then the elder statesman who warned about the military-industrial complex. But the decision he was most associated with, the one that defined him in the public mind, was always June 4th, 1944. The weather, the room, the note in the pocket, the 2 words. It is a smaller decision than it looks when you describe its context. Small in the sense that it was brief, that it was spoken without ceremony, that the words themselves were unremarkable. But it was also as large as decisions get, as consequential for the course of history, as demanding of the specific qualities of judgment and character that it required, as fully the product of the specific human being who made it at the specific moment when it needed to be made. What Eisenhower demonstrated at Southwick House on June 4th, 1944 was not that he was the greatest military mind of his generation. Montgomery and Patton and Slim and several others were arguably more gifted tacticians. What he demonstrated was something rarer and, in the specific circumstances of Allied coalition warfare, more valuable. The ability to hold the full complexity of an enormous undertaking in mind, to synthesize the competing perspectives of brilliant and difficult subordinates, to make a clear decision under genuine uncertainty, and to bear the personal weight of the consequences without flinching or deflecting. That is not a common quality. It was the quality the moment required. He had it. Okay, we'll go. The subsequent story of the D-Day decision, the way it has been told and retold in the 80 years since it happened, reveals something interesting about how we understand leadership. The popular versions of the story tend to emphasize the drama of the decision, the weather, the uncertainty, the stakes. These are all real, but they sometimes obscure the specific quality of mind that the decision required. Not courage in the conventional sense, which is a response to immediate danger, but the specific kind of moral courage that is required to make an irreversible decision affecting hundreds of thousands of people under conditions of genuine uncertainty. When you understand the full implications of both the decision and its alternatives, Eisenhower had been developing this quality of mind throughout his career. He had been Pershing's aide in the 1920s, learning how a senior commander managed information and made decisions at the highest level. He had been MacArthur's aide in the Philippines in the 1930s, observing how a very different kind of military personality handled authority and its abuses. He had commanded forces in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, accumulating experience with the specific challenges of coalition command and amphibious operations. By the time he sat down in the library at Southwick House, he had spent 40 years building toward the specific decision that the evening required. The preparation was invisible in the moment. It is always invisible. The preparation that makes a critical decision look easier than it was. What was visible was the decision itself. 2 words, clearly spoken, after the right amount of deliberation and with the right acknowledgement of uncertainty. The note in his pocket was the acknowledgement of uncertainty. The 2 words were the decision. The men who received the order experienced it differently than their commander experienced giving it. The paratroopers who jumped into Normandy in the small hours of June 6, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the British 6th Airborne, were not thinking about the Supreme Commander's decision in the abstract terms in which it can be analyzed 80 years later. They were thinking about the specific terrain below them, the specific resistance they expected, the specific men in their sticks, and their companies who were depending on them. The order had reached them through layers of command, translated from strategic decision into operational plan, into tactical assignment, into the specific coordinates, and the specific time, and the specific mission. By the time it reached the paratroopers, it was not okay, we'll go. It was jump. The beach assault troops who came off their landing craft at dawn had a similarly specific and immediate relationship to the decision. They did not experience the strategic weight of the D-Day landings as an abstract military historical event. They experienced the water and the fire and the sand and the specific men dying around them and the immediate imperative to get up the beach and get off the beach and survive the next minute. The decision that had sent them there, made in a library in the rain, by a man they had probably never seen, was present in their situation without being accessible to their consciousness. This gap between the commander's view from the top and the soldier's view from the ground is one of the permanent features of large-scale military operations, and Eisenhower understood it more clearly than most senior commanders of his era. He made a point of visiting troops in their embarkation areas in the days before the invasion, not for photographs, though photographs were taken, but because he believed it was important for a commander to see the men he was sending into danger and to be seen by them. He visited the 101st Airborne on the evening of June 5th, hours before their jump, walking among them, talking to them, being present with them in the specific way that a commander can be present when he understands that his decisions and their lives are bound together. One of the paratroopers who met him that evening later described the encounter. He said Eisenhower asked him where he was from, and when the trooper said Texas, Eisenhower said he had a friend in Texas, and they talked briefly about nothing in particular. The trooper said he didn't think much of it at the time, just a general talking to his men, before a jump, the way generals did. Later, when he understood what the decision to send them had cost Eisenhower and what it had cost his unit, he thought about that conversation differently. The general who had sent him to jump into France in the dark had wanted to know where he was from, had wanted, for a moment, to see him as a person rather than a unit in an order of battle. That is the other dimension of Eisenhower's decision, the human dimension that the strategic analysis tends to leave out. Every one of the men he sent into France was a specific person with a specific history and a specific set of people who would grieve for them if they died. Eisenhower understood this, and the understanding was part of what made the decision hard in a way that it would not have been hard for a commander who had made himself indifferent to the human cost of the choices he was making. The note in his pocket was not just a statement of responsibility. It was evidence of a specific quality of moral seriousness. the refusal to make the decision without fully acknowledging what it cost. He was accepting, in the act of writing the note, that he was responsible not just for the decision, but for all of its consequences, including the consequences he could not foresee and could not control. He was accepting that the lives of the men who crossed those beaches were, in a specific and irrevocable way, a consequence of his decision, and that if they died in an operation that failed, the responsibility was his. The operation did not fail, but the men still died. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers were killed on June 6, 1944. Thousands more were wounded. The decision was right, and it still cost what it cost. And the specific gravity of that fact, the fact that a right decision still produced real deaths of real people, is something that the note in the pocket acknowledges in a way that the triumphalist narrative of D-Day does not always make room for. Eisenhower carried the weight of this for the rest of his life, in the specific way that men who have sent other men to die carry it. Not as guilt, exactly, because he had done what the situation required and he knew it, but as a specific knowledge about what decisions at his level of responsibility actually meant and actually cost. He became president in 1953. He served 2 terms. He gave one of the most famous farewell addresses in American history, warning about the military-industrial complex and the specific dangers of society that becomes too comfortable with the ongoing cost of military power. The man who had sent 156,000 men across the channel in the rain knew something specific about that cost. Okay, we'll go. Those 2 words are the hinge on which one of the largest military operations in history turned. They were spoken by a man who had spent 40 years preparing to say them, who understood what they meant and what they would cost, who wrote a note acknowledging the possibility of failure before he gave the order that made success possible, and who then spent the next 10 months executing the campaign that finished the war in Europe and the next 2 terms in the White House, trying to prevent the conditions that would require another man to sit in another room and say them again. He did not entirely succeed in that last effort. The Cold War required its own decisions, its own costs, its own impossible choices made by specific men under conditions of uncertainty and consequence. But the specific quality of leadership that June 4th, 1944 acquired, the synthesis, the patience, the willingness to decide, the moral seriousness about what decisions cost, that quality does not become less necessary because a specific decision is passed. It becomes more necessary as each generation has to find it again for the specific challenges that its specific moment presents. The trailer at Southwick House is gone. The library where the conference was held is still there, maintained as part of a historic site. The note is in Abilene. And the decision, 2 words clearly spoken after the right amount of deliberation, is part of the permanent record of what was required and what one man was able to give in the specific hour when the war needed it most. The problem was the weather. Operation Overlord required specific meteorological conditions to be viable. The airborne drops that would precede the beach landings needed darkness, and then sufficient light, a specific phase of the moon. The naval bombardment needed enough light to be accurate. The landing craft needed low enough tide to clear the beach obstacles that Rommel had placed on the approaches to beaches, and then enough tide remaining to float the craft back off once they had beached. These requirements pointed to a narrow window, a few days in early June when all the conditions would approximately align. June 5th had been the target date for months. On June 3rd, the weather forecast changed. Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, delivered a report that was alarming in its specificity. A deep depression moving across the Atlantic was going to bring high winds, heavy overcast, and seas too rough for landing craft to operate safely. June 5th was no longer viable. The operation would have to be postponed. Postponement was not a small thing. The force was already assembled. Ships were loaded. Troops were in their embarkation areas. The deception operations that had convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, the double-cross network that we talked about in an earlier episode of this series, were in a delicate balance that a prolonged delay could upset. The logistical machinery that had been wound up for the June 5th date would have to be wound down and wound back up at enormous cost and at significant risk of compromising security of the operation. And if the June window was missed entirely, the next acceptable window would not open until late June or July. Weeks away, with all the strategic implications of that delay, Eisenhower postponed to June 5th. then postponed again when Stagg's updated forecast still showed conditions too severe for the landing. The operation was now tentatively scheduled for June 6th, if and only if Stagg's forecast for a brief improvement in the weather proved accurate. The meeting on the evening of June 4th, in the library at Southwick House, was the most consequential military conference of the war. Eisenhower's senior commanders were assembled. Montgomery, in command of the ground forces, Bertram Ramsay, the naval commander, Trafford Lee Mallory, the air commander, Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy. Stagg arrived with his latest forecast. The improvement was there, Stagg reported. A brief window, roughly 36 hours, of acceptable conditions was opening. The seas would still be rougher than ideal. The cloud cover would still be significant. The airborne operations would be conducted in conditions that the air commanders found concerning, but the window existed. The question was whether to use it. Eisenhower went around the room. Montgomery, characteristically, was direct. I would say go. Ramsay hedged. The naval conditions were marginal but manageable if the decision was to go. Lee Mallory expressed his concerns about the air operations. Tedder was uncertain. Eisenhower looked at the forecasts. He looked at the room. He understood that no one else in the room could make this decision, that by rank and by authority and by the specific nature of his role as Supreme Commander, the decision belonged to him alone. He understood that the forecasts were imperfect, that Stagg was extrapolating from models that could not reliably predict what 36 hours of English Channel weather would look like. He understood that going meant committing 156,000 men to a landing on a defended coast under conditions that were less than ideal, and that the consequences of a failed landing were catastrophic, not just militarily, but politically, for the entire Allied cause. He also understood what waiting meant. Another month at minimum before the next window. The increasing risk to operational security, as more people knew more about more details of the plan, and the German intelligence services continued their work. The political implications of delay for the relationship between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, who had been demanding a second front for years, and the larger strategic picture, the Soviet offensive that was being planned in coordination with Overlord, which was predicated on a June invasion, and which could not simply be reset if the Western Allies decided to wait. Eisenhower was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, we'll go." The words were not dramatic. They were the words of a man who had thought about a decision very carefully, who had taken the counsel available to him, who understood the alternatives and their consequences, and who then exercised the authority that his position gave him and that no one else in the room possessed. He gave the order. He went back to his trailer. He wrote the note that acknowledged the possibility of failure and accepted personal responsibility for it. And then he went to bed. In the early hours of June 6th, the first Allied airborne troops descended into Normandy. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. At H hour, the landing craft hit the beaches. On 4 of the 5 beaches, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, the landings achieved their objectives at acceptable cost. On the 5th, Omaha. The operation came as close to the catastrophe that Eisenhower's note had anticipated as any single element of D-Day would. The German defenses were intact. The naval bombardment had been ineffective, and the men of the 1st Infantry Division came off their landing craft into fire that was immediate and lethal. More than 2,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. But the beach was taken. The beachhead held. The follow-on forces came ashore, and by the end of June 6, the Allied foothold in Normandy was established firmly enough that the Wehrmacht could not throw it back into the sea. The decision to go had been right, but it had been right by a margin that was not comfortable, and it had been right in part because of factors that Eisenhower could not have known on the evening of June 4th. The German response to the landings was slower than it might have been, partly because of the fortitude deception that kept German reserves waiting for the Calais attack. Rommel was absent from his headquarters on the morning of the landings. He was in Germany for his wife's birthday, having calculated that the weather was too bad for the Allies to invade. The specific tactical situations that developed on each beach were shaped by chance and courage, and the individual decisions of thousands of men, in ways that no plan could predict and no commander could control. What Eisenhower could control was a decision to go, and the character of that decision, made alone under uncertainty, accepting personal responsibility for failure while giving the order that made success possible, is worth understanding as fully as the military outcomes it produced. The decision-making process at Southwick House has been studied by military theorists, business school professors, and leadership experts for 80 years because it represents a specific model of decision-making under uncertainty that has broader relevance than the specific military context. Eisenhower had access to the best information available. He consulted the relevant experts. He took counsel from his most experienced subordinates. And then, when the counsel was incomplete and the experts disagreed, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain, he made the decision. He did not wait for more certainty, because more certainty was not available. He did not defer to the consensus, because there was no consensus. He made the call, the specific quality that this required, the willingness to accept uncertainty, to make an irreversible decision without knowing whether it was right, to bear the personal weight of the consequences if it turned out to be wrong, is not a quality that can be trained in a conventional sense. It is a quality that develops through the accumulation of experience and judgment, through the specific kind of character that is built by taking responsibility repeatedly over a long career. Eisenhower had been building it for 40 years. The moment at Southwick House was when it was required. The note in Eisenhower's pocket is the most eloquent evidence of what the decision cost him. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures or self-dramatization. The note was practical. It was a statement that would be needed if the operation failed, and the Supreme Commander had to explain to the world why he had given the order. Writing it required him to contemplate, fully and specifically, what failure would look like and what it would mean. The fact that he wrote it before giving the order, rather than hoping he would not need it, reflects a specific kind of moral honesty about the risks he was taking and the responsibility he was accepting. The landing succeeded. The note was never used. Eisenhower found it in his pocket days later and almost threw it away. A staff officer saw it and preserved it. It is now in the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, the town where the general was born, the town that produced, in some way that is not easy to explain, the specific character of a man who could write that note and then give that order and then wait in the dark to see what the morning would bring. The morning brought the Allied foothold in France. The morning brought the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. The morning brought, 10 months later, the German surrender. None of it was inevitable. All of it was contingent on 100 things going approximately right, in the specific ways that warfare allows, and in the specific ways that courage and preparation and luck and the decisions of individual men at specific moments can make them go right. And it was contingent, before any of those other things, on a 53-year-old general from Kansas sitting in a trailer in the rain on the evening of June 4th and saying 2 words that changed the world. Okay, we'll go. That is what the decision looked like. That is what leadership looks like when it matters most. Not the gesture, not the speech, not the famous photograph. A man alone in a trailer, with a note in his pocket that he hoped he would never use, giving an order that only he could give. The specific legacy of D-Day in the cultural memory of the Allied nations, particularly in American memory, is worth examining because of how it shapes the way the decision is understood. D-Day has become, in American popular culture, one of the defining images of the nation at its best, of the combination of industrial power, military organization, and individual courage that the Second World War demanded and that the nation provided. The beaches of Normandy, particularly Omaha Beach, have acquired a quasi-sacred quality in the national memory that the men who fought there would probably find surprising and somewhat alien to their own experience of what those beaches were like. The memorialization of D-Day have produced some of the most powerful cultural artifacts of the post-war era: the photographs, the films, the memoirs, and in particular Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, whose opening sequence depicting the Omaha landing achieved something that few works of art have achieved: a representation of combat that the veterans who saw it recognized as genuinely close to the reality of the experience. Veterans who saw the film described symptoms consistent with acute stress reactions. The footage was accurate in its depiction of the sensory reality of what Omaha Beach had been like. But memorialization also simplifies, and the simplification of D-Day has tended to flatten the complexity of what Eisenhower decided and why. The popular version of the decision is essentially, the weather was bad, the generals were worried, but Eisenhower said go. This is correct, but insufficient. It leaves out the specific quality of synthesis that the decision required. The ability to integrate the meteorological, the tactical, the strategic, the political, and the human dimensions of the situation into a single judgment. It leaves out the note in the pocket, which is the most honest document in the D-Day record. And it leaves out the specific understanding that made the decision possible. The knowledge that waiting was also a choice with its own costs, and that perfect conditions were not available and would not become available, and that the window was closing. The D-Day anniversary ceremonies, conducted every 5 years at the Normandy beaches, have brought successive generations of leaders, American presidents, British prime ministers, French presidents, to stand at the cliffs and the cemeteries and acknowledge what was done there. The ceremonies have their own value and their own importance. But the acknowledgement that happens at the ceremony, public, formal, attended by cameras, is different from the acknowledgement that happened in the trailer, private, attended by no one, in the form of a note that the man who wrote it hoped he would never need. The trailer acknowledgement is the more important one, not because the public ceremony is hollow. It is not. But because the private acknowledgement is the one that reveals what the decision actually cost, and what the man who made it was willing to accept, and what it means to take responsibility for a choice that affects the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who are trusting you to get it right. There will always be moments when someone has to say, okay, we'll go, when the information is incomplete, and the window is closing, and the alternatives all have their own costs, and the decision cannot be deferred without the deferral itself becoming a choice. In those moments, the note in the pocket is the right preparation, not the guarantee of success. There are no guarantees. The preparation for possibility of failure, the acceptance of personal responsibility for the outcome, the refusal to let the cost of the decision fall anywhere but on the person who made it. Eisenhower wrote the note. He gave the order. He waited in the dark. The morning came, and the beaches held, and the note stayed in his pocket for years before anyone else saw it. That is how it is supposed to work. That is what the job is. That is what it costs when it is done right by the right person at the right moment. Okay, we'll go.